Ladies and gentlemen, there is a truth few people are prepared to hear, and even fewer are ready to accept. The moment you walked away, you didn't just end a relationship, you triggered something far deeper. Somewhere behind the silence, behind the false confidence and forced smiles, a mind that once fed on your presence is beginning to unravel, not because you were cruel, not because you wanted revenge, but because your absence exposed a reality they can no longer escape. Tonight, I want you to listen closely because this is not just a story about their collapse. It is a story about your power, your freedom, and what happens when you finally choose yourself and never look back. Walking away is not abandonment. Even though it may have felt that way in the beginning, for a long time you were trained to believe that staying, enduring, explaining, and sacrificing yourself was loyalty, love, or strength. You were conditioned to feel guilty for choosing your own peace, as if protecting your mental and emotional health was a betrayal. But walking away was not an act of cruelty, it was an act of survival. There comes a point when remaining in a dynamic that drains you is no longer patience, it is self-erasure. You weren't leaving to punish anyone, you weren't leaving to prove a point. You were leaving because your nervous system was exhausted, your spirit was shrinking, and your sense of self was being slowly worn down. Self-preservation often looks selfish to those who benefit from your self-neglect. A narcissist frames your departure as abandonment because it allows them to avoid accountability. If they can label you as the one who left, they never have to face the damage they caused. But abandonment is when someone leaves a healthy bond without reason or care. What you did was step away from a cycle that required your pain to keep functioning. That is not abandonment. That is recognizing danger and choosing safety. There is a deep courage in choosing yourself when you've been taught that love means endurance. Walking away required you to override guilt, fear, and the hope that things might someday change. It required you to accept that saving yourself was more important than saving an illusion. You didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because you finally cared enough about yourself to stop bleeding silently. And in that moment, something shifted. You reclaimed ownership of your life. You stopped negotiating your worth. You chose to live instead of merely survive. That choice was not abandonment. It was the first honest act of love you had shown yourself in a very long time. And once you chose yourself, once you stepped out of that cycle of self-erasure, something invisible but powerful changed on the other side. The narcissist did not experience your departure as a normal ending. They experienced it as a sudden loss of control. Because narcissists do not connect through mutual respect or emotional safety. They survive through dominance, attention, and reaction. That is the currency they live on. For them, love is not something shared. It is something extracted. Every explanation you gave, every tear you shed, every time you tried to be understood, it fed the system. Your emotions reassured them that they still mattered, that they still had access to your inner world. Even conflict was valuable because it meant engagement. Silence, however, is something they are not equipped to handle. When you walked away, you didn't just remove yourself physically, you removed the emotional supply that stabilized their identity. Imagine someone whose sense of self only exists when reflected back by others. When that reflection disappears, there is nothing solid underneath. What looks like confidence begins to shake. What sounded like certainty turns into panic. This is why your absence feels unbearable to them. Without your reactions, they are left with an internal emptiness they have spent their entire life avoiding. They may rage, rewrite history, or portray themselves as the victim. But beneath all of it is desperation. They are scrambling to restore a sense of power that depended on you staying small and emotionally available. And here is the quiet truth. Your healing disrupts their system. Not because you are trying to hurt them, but because their stability was never internal. It was borrowed from you. When you stopped supplying it, the imbalance became impossible to hide. What you are witnessing now is not strength unraveling. It is a fragile structure collapsing without the energy that once held it together. And as that borrowed stability begins to collapse, the silence you created becomes the loudest force in the room. To you, silence may feel calm, even necessary. To them, it feels like chaos. Because a narcissistic mind is not built to sit quietly with itself. It is built to react, to provoke, to dominate the emotional environment. When there is no response to feed on, the mind turns inward. And that is where the real distress begins. Your silence is not passive, it is not weakness, it is an absence that exposes everything they worked so hard to cover. Without your emotional reactions, they can no longer regulate themselves through you. There is no reassurance, no validation, no emotional friction to distract them from their own inner instability. The quiet forces them to confront a void they never learned how to face. This is why silence triggers a kind of fixation. They replay conversations, search for meaning in your absence, and attempt to provoke a response through indirect messages, sudden kindness, or manufactured crisis, not because they miss you in a healthy way, but because they need proof that they still exist in your emotional world. Your attention was the anchor that kept their sense of importance intact. As days pass without reaction, anxiety intensifies, frustration follows, confusion sets in. The mind begins to fracture under the pressure of not being able to control the narrative. This is where the internal collapse takes shape, not all at once, but in cracks that deepen every time you refuse to engage. Meanwhile, something entirely different is happening within you. Your nervous system is learning safety again. Your thoughts are no longer hijacked by their moods. The space that once held tension is slowly filling with clarity. The silence that unsettles them is the same silence that heals you, and that contrast is powerful. While they unravel trying to regain control, you are stabilizing by letting go. Your quiet presence is not an attack, it is a boundary, and that boundary becomes the mirror they can no longer escape. And as that boundary hardens into something steady and unmovable, the loss of access to you begins to register in a way they never anticipated. What once felt optional to them now feels essential. Your presence was not just companionship, it was oxygen. It regulated their emotions, affirmed their importance, and distracted them from the emptiness they could never sit with for long. When you disappeared from that role, the panic became visceral. At first, they told themselves they didn't need you. Pride demanded that. But slowly, the truth surfaced in moments they couldn't control. In quiet rooms, in sleepless nights, in the absence of someone to absorb their tension and reflect back a sense of power. Without access to you, their emotional footing becomes shaky. Every day without contact feels like deprivation, not because of love, but because of dependence. This is why they may reach out suddenly, indirectly, or dramatically. Not with accountability, not with genuine understanding, but with urgency. The goal is not connection, the goal is relief. They are chasing the familiar emotional exchange that once kept them stable. When it doesn't come, frustration turns inward. The mask slips. Irritability, impulsive decisions, and self-sabotaging behavior begin to surface. Meanwhile, you are no longer being drained to keep someone else functioning. You are no longer the emotional life support system for a dynamic that thrived on imbalance. Your energy, once siphoned away, is returning to you. You are breathing deeply again, even if it still feels unfamiliar. This contrast is where the truth becomes undeniable. What they called love was reliance. What they called confidence was dependence. And what they are experiencing now is withdrawal from a source they never learned how to live without. You didn't take something from them. You stopped giving something that was costing you your peace. And in doing so, you revealed a reality they can no longer avoid. Without controlling another person's emotional world, they are forced to face their own. And that realization, for someone who has spent a lifetime running from themselves, is suffocating. And in that suffocating realization, something else begins to crumble. The image they worked so tirelessly to maintain. What once looked like unshakable confidence starts to reveal itself as a carefully balanced performance. The charm, the certainty, the sense of superiority were never rooted in inner strength. They were armor, and armor only works as long as no one sees what's underneath. Without you there to reflect admiration, fear, or emotional investment, the performance loses its audience. The applause stops, the spotlight fades, and suddenly the person who seemed so powerful is left exposed, unsure of who they are without someone else validating the role they play. This is where the mask cracks. You start to see it in their behavior, even from a distance. Inconsistent moods, grand gestures that feel hollow, boasts that sound louder than necessary. These are not signs of confidence. They are signs of someone desperately trying to convince themselves that the image still exists. When no one is watching, the act becomes exhausting. This is the truth they never wanted to face. Real strength does not require control. Genuine confidence does not collapse in silence. What they displayed was not self-assurance, but compensation, a fragile identity propped up by dominance and emotional leverage. And the moment you stop participating, the illusion could no longer sustain itself. Meanwhile, your own sense of self is beginning to root more deeply. You are no longer measuring your worth through their approval or their reactions. You are learning what it feels like to stand without armor, without performance, without fear of losing yourself. And that quiet authenticity is something they never mastered. Their unraveling is not dramatic at first. It is subtle, a slow erosion of certainty, a growing unease when control no longer works. The very traits that once intimidated you now look brittle, almost desperate. And in that contrast, you begin to understand something powerful. The strength you thought they had was always within you. They just borrowed it until you took it back. And as you take that strength back and begin to live from a place that no longer revolves around them, something deeply unsettling happens in their inner world. Your healing becomes a mirror they cannot avoid. Not because you are showing it off, not because you are trying to prove anything, but because your peace highlights what they have been running from their entire lives. The emptiness that once stayed hidden behind control and performance is now fully exposed. When you start to grow calmer, clearer, more grounded, it contradicts the story they told themselves about you. They needed to believe you were nothing without them, that you would fall apart, that you would come back. Your stability disrupts that fantasy. It forces them to confront a difficult possibility that you were never the problem and that they were never the source of your worth. This realization strikes at the core of their identity. Narcissistic structures are built on comparison and dominance. They need someone beneath them to feel above. When you rise quietly without resentment or revenge, you remove the contrast that kept them feeling superior. Your healing doesn't just threaten their ego, it dissolves the illusion it depended on. Inside them, the emptiness grows louder. There is no longer a partner to project it onto. No one to blame, no one to drain. What they once avoided through chaos now sits front and center. That is why they may attempt to belittle your progress, dismiss your peace, or rewrite history to preserve their self-image. But none of it works the way it used to, because you are no longer available to carry what was never yours. And here is the quiet truth that changes everything. Your healing was never about them. It was about reclaiming your inner life. Yet in doing so, you revealed something they cannot tolerate. That wholeness is possible without control, without manipulation, without an audience. You are becoming real, grounded, free. And in the presence of that authenticity, their inner emptiness has nowhere left to hide. And because that emptiness has nowhere left to hide, they begin to experience your absence not as a neutral loss, but as something that feels deeply personal, almost like a punishment. Even though you did not set out to hurt them, even though you left quietly and chose peace over conflict, the narcissistic mind interprets loss through distortion. To them, your absence feels like rejection, exposure, and humiliation all at once. They tell themselves a story where you are cruel for leaving, cold for not responding, heartless for not looking back. This narrative protects them from the truth they cannot face, that your departure was a response, not an attack. But internally, it doesn't settle them. It agitates them, because every day you remain gone reinforces a message they cannot escape. You no longer need them. That realization lands like a consequence they never consented to receive. Not because you intended it, but because their identity was built on being indispensable. When you walked away and survived, when you walked away and improved, it shattered the belief that they were central to your existence. And for someone who needs to be needed to feel real, that feels like erasure. This is why your absence provokes such intense emotional reactions behind the scenes. Frustration mixed with longing, superiority mixed with insecurity. They may try to win the breakup in their mind, to prove they are thriving, to convince others they were unaffected, but privately the wound stays open. Your silence keeps reminding them of what they lost control over. Meanwhile, you are not punishing anyone. You are simply living, and that is the part they cannot tolerate because your peace was never supposed to be possible without them. Your joy was never supposed to exist outside their reach. So what they experience as punishment is actually consequence, the natural outcome of losing access to someone who once carried their emotional weight. And while they wrestle with that reality, you continue forward, lighter, clearer, no longer responsible for someone else's sense of self. And as that consequence settles in, something within you becomes unshakable. Emotional detachment takes root, not as coldness, but as clarity. This is the boundary they cannot cross, negotiate, or manipulate. Because emotional detachment is not built on anger or resistance. It is built on acceptance. You have accepted who they are, what the dynamic was, and what it cost you. And in that acceptance, their power dissolves. Before, your emotions were the doorway. Through guilt, hope, empathy, and fear, they could still reach you. Even conflict kept the connection alive. But detachment closes the door quietly. You no longer explain, you no longer defend, you no longer seek understanding from someone incapable of offering it. And that absence of emotional access is what finally breaks the cycle. For the narcissist, this is unbearable. They can argue with anger, they can manipulate sadness, they can exploit compassion, but they cannot compete with indifference rooted in self-respect. Detachment gives them nothing to push against. No leverage, no reaction, no reward. And this is where the real shift happens. You stop measuring your worth through their perception. You stop scanning your mind for the right response. You stop carrying their emotional storms as if they were your responsibility. Your energy returns to you, steady and contained. The chaos that once followed them no longer follows you. From their perspective, it feels like disappearance, like you slipped out of their grasp without a sound. That is why they may escalate, provoke, or attempt to reinsert themselves into your emotional world. Not because they have changed, but because detachment threatens their sense of control more than distance ever did. But you are no longer available for that role. Emotional detachment is not punishment. It is freedom with boundaries. It is choosing peace over explanation. And once you reach this place, you realize something profound. They cannot reach you anymore. Not because you are hiding, but because you are finally standing on your own ground. And from that solid ground you're standing on now, a deeper understanding settles in. What is happening to them is not something you orchestrated. It is not something you wished into existence. Their unraveling is not revenge dressed up as karma. It is consequence, the natural result of a life built on control instead of connection. For a long time, you may have been told, directly or indirectly, that if they struggled, it was because of you. If they were angry, it was your fault. If they fell apart, it was because you didn't love them the right way. That belief kept you tethered, over-responsible, and exhausted. Walking away broke that illusion, and watching what follows confirms a truth that is both painful and freeing. You were never the cause of their instability. A narcissistic structure collapses when it can no longer extract what it needs from others. That collapse would have happened eventually with or without you, because it was never sustainable. You did not push them over the edge. You simply stepped out of the way and stopped holding the structure up with your emotional labor. This is why guilt no longer fits the situation, even if it tries to resurface. You didn't destroy anything. You stopped sacrificing yourself to prevent an inevitable reckoning. Their distress is the echo of patterns catching up with them, patterns of avoidance, entitlement, and emotional dependency that were never addressed. Understanding this is crucial because it releases you from the need to justify your healing. You don't have to soften your growth to spare their ego. You don't have to shrink your peace to make their collapse feel less dramatic. Their struggle is not proof that you were wrong to leave.